Oh, sorry. Hey, I didn't know we were on. Theme song. Hey everybody, I do apologize for that. I didn't know we were going to be filming today. I was just grooving. But this is episode 2 of our series on rhetoric. This episode is about ethos, and I want to remind you of something I said back in episode 1 of this series, which is that I will be talking about James Baldwin's text, A Letter to My Nephew. It is a fantastic argument, and it works great as a mentor text for ethos, pathos, and logos. If you have not read it, you very seriously need to hit pause right now. Go down to the description. It's the first link. Click through, read it. It'll take you 4 minutes, 5 minutes at the most, and then you'll come back and you'll be ready to talk about ethos. I want to do a quick review of the definition of rhetoric in general, which is that rhetoric is the set of tools that writers and speakers have and use to make their arguments more convincing, to make their texts sound better, seem smarter, and get the point across better to their audience. And one of those sets of tools is ethos. It's all about a writer or a speaker establishing credibility with the audience, some trustworthiness, some sense of, yes, reader, you can believe what I am saying. You can accept what I'm telling you because I am the best person to be making this argument at this time. That's the most basic definition of ethos. Now, ethos does have some other meanings besides the rhetorical sense of ethos, and that includes one of my favorite uses of ethos is when you're talking about an organization or a company, the ethos of that company is kind of the image or the sense that is projected by that company. And every company has an ethos. Some rely on it a little bit more heavily than others. And I'll give you an example. Even though Dove soap and Old Spice are both vaguely lumped together in the category of personal care products, the ethos of the Dove soap company is very different from the ethos of the Old Spice company. If you watch an advertisement from either of those two things, you'll realize that they're trying to appeal to very different audiences, and they're doing it by adopting very different personas or very different senses or images of who and what they are. Even I have been trying to maintain a particular ethos for this web series, although that ethos can change based on the way I dress or don't. In the same way that pretty much every company, every business, every organization has its own ethos, authors and speakers also have their own ethos. And again, some of them will lean more heavily on that ethos or will appeal more strongly to ethos than other writers. And this is important, the way that I'm talking about ethos here, because one thing that you don't want to do, you don't want to say, if you're writing an analysis of some text, you don't want to say, here the writer uses ethos. I mean, that would be kind of like saying, here the person is breathing air. Everyone uses ethos. Everyone has ethos. What happens, though, is that some writers will appeal to ethos. They will sort of put their ethos out there in front of you. They will try to establish their credibility more heavily or more clearly than other writers. So don't say, never write, the author uses ethos. You can say the author appeals to ethos, but even more than that, you can say this speaker is attempting to establish credibility by doing this, or this speaker seems credible and believable because this, and you don't even have to use the word ethos. This is important because you might remember from my previous series on analysis, one of the things that you can't do is just name a technique. That was the no Waldo's rule. So if you say the writer is using ethos, you're naming the technique. But if you use a construction like the author establishes trust with the audience by doing X, Y, and Z, then you're talking about the effect of the technique and the effect of specific words or phrases in the text. And that is where your analysis is going to be great. So how do you recognize when an author is appealing to ethos? That is a great question. And I would basically start by saying you probably already do recognize when authors are appealing to ethos. You just don't think of it in those terms. And I'll give you a great example. If you have ever listened to hip hop music or to rap music, you have probably heard something that might be called a hype verse, where either the rapper himself or herself or someone, a friend, takes a verse or part of a verse to play up the qualifications of that particular artist. This happens all the time in hip hop, and I have seen it in my own students when they are, freestyling or writing their own raps. They will include hype verses. Now, the hype verse is something that's very specific, and it's not the kind of appeal that you would necessarily put into an essay, but it is something that exists. And if you can start to listen to that, then you can begin to recognize when other authors are appealing to ethos. And I just want to talk about a very specific example. I am totally stealing this from a blog post by science librarian, yeah, that is a thing, science librarian Alex Carroll, who is writing about the hype verse and the lessons it could have for librarians. But here's something great that he says. It took an insane amount of hubris for Jay-Z to drop a track in 1996 called Brooklyn's Finest. Here you've got a guy on his first LP putting himself on a track with Biggie Smalls and calling himself one of the best two rappers in Brooklyn. Jay-Z presented himself as the best over and over again and did it so convincingly that people eventually just started to agree with him. That's a perfect summation of what an appeal to ethos really means. That if you establish repeatedly in either a single text or a series of texts that you are credible and that you are an expert and that you are good at what you do and you are the best person to make this argument at this time, people will believe you, even if some of it is just hype. Okay, let me give you another example from the genre of hip hop. You may be aware that a number of rappers have been shot. Some of them have not lived, Biggie. Others of them have, Tupac. It's true. But regardless, the ones who do live, they put that into their music because that really, they think, helps to establish their own credibility as rappers. There's something about having been shot that gives them street cred. And this includes everybody from Timbaland to Ghostface Killer to Waka Flocka Flame to Tupac to Lil Wayne to 50 Cent and so many more. Part of their street cred, part of their ethos is that they survived a shooting, and that allows audiences to trust that they're authentic and that they're real. So what about James Baldwin? You're saying he was not a rapper who got shot. He's not putting in a hype verse. No. There are a couple of things. Number one, he's writing a letter to his nephew, and so there's some built-in credibility. Like, oh, hey, Uncle James, you're writing me a letter, and I respect you as my uncle, and I want to listen to you. But here's the thing. Baldwin didn't take this letter to his nephew and put it into an envelope and seal it up and put it in the mail and instruct his nephew James never to show it to anybody. He published this in a magazine, The Progressive, a magazine with a primarily white readership, but it was a white readership that in 1962 would have been very much in favor of equality and civil rights. So when Baldwin goes into this argument where he's going to kind of say that white people, not just the Jim Crow bigots in the South, but, other white people, they kind of have problems. There's kind of an issue there. He needs to make sure that this audience in the Progressive magazine is willing to listen to him when he says that. So there's this explicitly stated audience of his nephew James, but there's the real intended audience, the readership of that magazine, and he's got to walk a line in order to accomplish that. Now, in his very first paragraph, he does lean pretty heavily on the Uncle James thing. I have known both of you all your lives, and I've carried your daddy in my arms and on my shoulders, kissed him and spanked him, and watched him learn to walk. There's an explicit appeal to his credibility with his nephew James. But remember, his nephew James is not his only or even primary audience. He has to establish some credibility with the white readership. And he begins to do that in paragraph 3. And it's a very subtle thing that he does, because he does literally say, I know stuff. But he doesn't say, I know all about civil rights and I know what's best for you, white America. No, he says this: I know what the world has done to my brother and how narrowly he has survived it. And I know, which is much worse, that this is the crime of which I accuse my country and my countrymen. So he's still talking to his nephew James, but now he's begun to broaden, to open up a little bit that sense of his knowledge, that scope of his knowledge, where he begins to say, I didn't just carry your daddy around when he was a baby, when he was a younger boy. I also have sort of seen what's happening in the country. And it's only after he says that, at the beginning of paragraph 3, I know what is going on, it's only after that that he lays out his actual claim. That they, this is white America, that they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives and do not know it and do not want to know it. Then at the end of the paragraph he adds, it is not permissible that the authors of devastation should also be innocent. It is the innocence which constitutes the crime. So after he has stated explicitly, although in a very subtle way because he's addressing it to his nephew James, he has stated explicitly, I know the state of America, I know the state of the world, I know what my countrymen, these white Americans, I know what they have done, I know what they are doing, and I know that when they play innocent, that is the bigger part of the crime. So he has to establish that credibility in a wider sense before he begins to say what his actual argument really is. And then in paragraph 4, Baldwin goes a little bit deeper by setting up a contrast between what he knows and what his countrymen, the white Americans that he's really trying to reach. He sets up a difference between what they respectively know and have experienced. He says this: I know the conditions under which you were born, for I was there. Your countrymen were not there and haven't made it yet. Your countrymen don't know that she, your grandmother, exists either, though she has been working for them all their lives. That's a very, very effective contrast or antithesis there. This whole I was there, I know, contrasted in the second half of the paragraph with your countrymen were not there, they do not know. So again, he's beginning to establish his authority to say these things because he was there and he knows. And then there's paragraph 6. I love paragraph 6. Paragraph 6 does something remarkably fun, remarkably amazing in terms of an appeal to ethos. He has this explicitly stated audience of his nephew James, but he's not really talking to his nephew James. So what he does in that paragraph is he talks to you. He talks to his nephew James. And by addressing his complaints about the way white Americans have treated African Americans over the centuries, by putting that on you, my nephew James, he's saying, he's being slightly less threatening, or maybe even you could say significantly less threatening to the white Americans who are reading this. I mean, look at this paragraph. He says you 17 times in this paragraph, and that's not even counting all of the possessive yours, right? And it's things like, you were born into a society which spelled out with brutal clarity and as many ways as possible that you were a worthless human being. I mean, that's an indictment of the white Americans who are reading this, but it's being played as, oh, let me tell you about about yourself, my nephew James, or this one a little bit later. Wherever you have turned, James, in your short time here on Earth, you have been told where you could go and what you could do and how you could do it, where you could live and whom you could marry. I mean, that is an impressive list of racism and institutional and otherwise that is going on here. But by saying to his nephew, man, this is what you face, he's kind of under the radar indicting the white Americans who are reading this. He's not angry. He's not insulting. He doesn't call white America names. And if you take a look at paragraphs 7, 8, and 9, the ones that immediately follow, there's more. He says things like, your countrymen, that they are innocent people, that they are trapped in a history. And even in paragraph 9, he says that they are lost. They are the lost younger brothers, which, the word lost, again, suggests maybe not as much direct complicity with the system, but that whole lost younger brothers. I mean, Baldwin spent the first part of this essay establishing that he knows how to take care of a younger brother. And so by saying things like your countrymen and that they are trapped and that they are lost, he is implicating them in the system, but he's not necessarily saying, it is your fault, you are terrible, you need to change. Obviously, he wants white Americans to change. He wouldn't have published this for a primarily white audience if he didn't. But he also doesn't want to turn them off. He doesn't want to seem overbearing and insulting and loud and angry. And there's an entire another set of commentary that we could do about the way African Americans in this country have to act in order to adequately address what is happening to them. I mean, again, I'm recording this series in 2017, and there is a tremendous discussion right now about taking a knee or kneeling or sitting during the national anthem at football games. Because apparently a silent protest during the national anthem to some people is not an appropriate means of protest. And, white people are telling black people what they can and cannot do to protest the conditions under which they live. America. Yeah. So in the end, what are the takeaways? I think there are two lessons related to ethos appeals here that I want to make sure you understand. One, of course, is that when you read, you should be looking for the kinds of things that I pointed out in Baldwin. Not only the moments where he talks explicitly about himself, I know, or when he compares himself to others, they were not there, they do not know, but also the kind of language that he uses, the choice of words and the choice of phrasing in order to not turn away the audience that he is trying to reach. Baldwin was making some very conscious and very careful decisions about what he wrote and how he wrote it. One mentor text that you have now read with an eye towards ethos appeals is not necessarily going to turn you into a great writer who appeals to ethos in the most subtle and complex ways all the time. But that is takeaway number 2, which is that you do have to make some choices. You have to be careful and you have to be deliberate in terms of what projection of ethos and image you put out there in any particular argument that you write. And no, you are not going to sit down as soon as this video is over and be as good at it as James Baldwin. But the more you practice it, the more you are mindful and careful about the persona that you put out there in your writing and the appeal to ethos that you are actually doing, the better you are going to be about tailoring that to your specific audience. And as you get better at appealing to ethos, you're also going to be more confident about making those appeals. You would be able to write the rhetorical equivalent of a hype verse. In fact, I'm going to give one of the last words in this episode to Carol, the librarian, because he said, "That's why it can be useful to remember the first commandment of hip-hop. If you don't believe in you, ain't nobody gonna believe in you." Well, I'm always gonna believe in you. I believe in you. Hopefully, you can start believing in yourself in terms of your writing. The next couple of episodes are about the other two appeals, pathos and logos, and then episode 5 of this series I'm saving for some of the fantastic language choices and syntactical or diction choices that Baldwin makes that are really worth talking about and digging into besides his appeals. So I'll see you for the next one. They do. And I'll give you an example. The ethos of the dub